The patrol car screeched to a stop beside the curb. The door opened. The officer stepped out with a hard look already on his face, scanning Antonio from head to toe like he had already decided what kind of person he was. Up against the wall! Now! Antonio stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, not out of obedience, out of choice. He planted his cane on the ground, straightened his shoulders, and stayed exactly where he was. He didn't move. The officer frowned. "I told you to get up against the wall." Antonio slowly raised his eyes, without hurry, without fear, without any theatrical defiance. "You can stop me, but you're not going to talk to me like that." The officer froze for a second. That wasn't what he expected to hear. "I'm giving you an order." Antonio didn't raise his voice, didn't make any sudden movement, didn't take a step back. "You're giving me an order without legal cause, and you're talking to me like I'm already guilty." The partner stood near the patrol car, watching in silence. The atmosphere shifted right there. "ID. Now." Antonio calmly took out his wallet, handed over his documents, and kept his eyes fixed on the officer's face. "Before that, I want to know why I was stopped." Suspicious behavior. Antonio tilted his head slightly. "Suspicious of what? Of me walking down the street?" The officer clenched his teeth. "Don't make this harder." Antonio replied without changing his tone, "I'm not making anything harder. I'm just demanding respect." The officer pointed at the wall. "Up against it. Last time." Antonio remained still. "You can stop me. You can ask for my ID. You can do your job." He paused briefly. "But you're not going to treat me like trash." The partner cleared his throat softly, uncomfortable. The officer took half a step forward. "Are you resisting an order?" Antonio answered immediately. "No, I'm resisting abuse." The silence grew heavy. Cars passed in the background, but right there, at that exact spot, the hierarchy had been interrupted. Antonio wasn't trying to defeat anyone. He was setting a boundary. "If you have legal cause to detain me, say it now. If you don't, we continue this conversation the right way." The officer scowled. "You think you run anything here?" Antonio replied without hesitation. "I run how I'm treated." The partner looked away for a second. The officer felt it. He felt that this man wasn't weak, wasn't confused, wasn't submissive, and most of all, he wasn't going to accept just anything. "Shut up and cooperate." Antonio replied, "I am cooperating. I'm just not accepting humiliation." The atmosphere was no longer about authority. It was about discomfort. And in that moment, without anyone yet knowing who he was, something became clear. That man was not going to bow his head. "And now I ask you, if it were you, would you stay silent? Or would you do exactly what Antonio did? Would you accept being treated like this?" The officer held Antonio's documents as if searching for a flaw that would justify his tone. He glanced at the name, the photo, the number, and handed them back with a dry, impatient movement. "Playing hard to get, huh? Up against the wall and stop talking." Antonio didn't move. He kept his body in the same place, the cane firm on the ground, and spoke with the same calm as before, but with more precision. "I gave you my ID. Now I want the reason." The officer smirked. "Reason? You think this is a consultation?" Antonio didn't respond with irritation. He responded with logic. "No. I'm reminding you of the basics. A stop needs a reason. An order needs grounds. And respect isn't optional." The partner, trying to ease things, took a discreet step and spoke in a lower tone. "Sir, just cooperate and we'll finish this quickly." Antonio slightly turned his face without losing firmness. "I am cooperating. What I'm not going to do is accept being treated as guilty before any explanation." The officer stepped closer, using his body as pressure. "Suspicious behavior." Antonio held his gaze. "Suspicious of what? Of me existing?" The partner froze for a moment. The officer clenched his jaw. "You like provoking, huh?" Antonio answered immediately without raising his tone. I like clarity. Provocation is stopping me without reason and expecting me to accept it in silence. The officer looked around as if searching for an opening. He didn't find one. He went back on the attack. You're disrespecting me. Antonio dropped a short, sharp line. Disrespect is treating me like a suspect without an accusation. The partner tried again, now more serious. Sir, we just want to make sure everything's okay. Antonio replied, firm, but without humiliating. Then do it the right way. Tell me what you saw. Tell me what you have. Tell me what the accusation is. The officer got irritated precisely because he didn't have one. And when someone doesn't have an argument, they usually try to win with weight. He brought his hand closer to his belt, not as a direct threat, but as a message. Antonio didn't step back. He didn't make a speech. He just made it clear, with simple words, if you can't explain why I was stopped, then you're not doing security. You're doing abuse. The partner swallowed hard. The officer stared at Antonio as if he wanted to break that calm by force. You trying to teach police how to work? Antonio replied calmly, I'm demanding what any citizen has the right to demand. And if that bothers you, it's because you're used to people bowing their heads. The atmosphere hardened completely. The officer turned his face, breathed short, and made a decision. And this is where I speak directly to you. How many times have you seen someone get crushed just for asking why? How many times have you yourself stayed quiet so it wouldn't get worse? Because what comes next isn't conversation, it's force. And the officer decided to force the situation. Do you think Antonio is right to demand the accusation right then, or would it have been better to let it go to avoid trouble? The officer took half a step back, then advanced again, not with words, with his hand going straight for the handcuffs. Antonio noticed before the metal came off the belt. He stepped back a single step. Nothing dramatic, nothing rushed, just enough to make it clear that wasn't going to happen that way. You have no legal cause whatsoever for this. The officer's hand hung in the air for half a second, long enough to show he wasn't expecting resistance. Turn around. Antonio kept his body facing forward, the cane firm on the ground, his eyes on the officer's face. I'm not being detained. I didn't commit a crime. And you're not going to cuff me without justification. The partner stepped a little closer, trying to read the situation. Sir, just make it easier. Antonio replied without turning his face. Make easier what? An abuse? The officer pulled the cuffs out for real. Stop playing smart. Antonio didn't raise his voice, didn't make a speech. He just said precisely, touch me without legal grounds. And this becomes abuse of authority. The atmosphere changed right there. It wasn't yelling. It wasn't threats. It was logic. The officer froze. Again. Are you refusing to obey? Antonio answered immediately. I'm refusing to be cuffed without cause. The partner took a deep breath. We're telling you to turn around. Antonio kept his tone firm. An illegal order isn't an order. And you know that. The officer scowled. You think you know more than the police? Antonio replied without irony. I know exactly where your power ends, and you just crossed that line. The officer took another step closer. Antonio didn't step back. Last chance, Antonio replied. Last chance for you not to make this worse. The partner raised his hand discreetly. Easy. The officer ignored him, tried to grab Antonio's arm. Antonio pulled his arm back, without violence, without shoving, just firm. Take your hand off me. The officer clenched his teeth. You're resisting arrest. Antonio answered immediately. There is no arrest without cause. And you don't have any. The silence among the three grew heavy. There was no authority left there. There was tension. The officer realized that any wrong move now wouldn't end well. You challenging me? Antonio replied without looking away. I'm stopping you from making a mistake. The partner finally intervened. Enough. There's no basis to cuff him. The officer turned his face, irritated. You taking his side now? The partner replied quietly, "I'm taking the side of the law." Antonio took a deep breath, not relieved, alert. "Put that away, and we continue this the right way." The officer hesitated 2 seconds, then put the cuffs back on his belt. The situation had flipped. Have you noticed this? When someone tries to use force and ends up losing control of the situation. Antonio hadn't touched anyone, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't humiliated anyone, but he had done something that changes any power game. He set a boundary, and in that moment, the hierarchy started to invert. Now I ask you, would you have the courage to say no right there, or would you turn around just to avoid trouble? Because not every handcuff we accept is made of metal. He looked first at the officer who had tried to cuff him, then at the partner, then at the patrol car, and spoke low, firm, without theatrics. "Write down your name, your partner's too, and the number of this patrol car." The officer let out a short, awkward laugh. "What are you going to do with that?" Antonio took half a step forward, not as a threat, as a warning. "I'm opening an investigation." The officer's smile disappeared. "Investigation into what?" "You're dreaming, old man." Antonio ignored the provocation. Stop without cause. Attempted handcuffing without legal basis. Offensive tone. Threat without accusation. He paused briefly. "That's not procedure. That's abuse." The partner looked away for a second. The officer crossed his arms, trying to regain control. "You really think anyone's going to take you seriously?" Antonio replied, without raising his voice. "I don't need you to take me seriously. I need the report too." The officer swallowed hard. "You don't even know who you're talking to." Antonio replied immediately, "I know exactly who I'm talking to. And that's why I'm asking for your details now." He pointed at the uniform pocket. "Name, badge number, patrol car plate." The officer shook his head, incredulous. "You think this is a joke?" Antonio kept his tone firm. "I think this is a mistake you still have time to stop making." The partner finally spoke. "What's your name, sir?" "Antonio Ribeiro." The officer let out another short laugh, now more tense. "You really going to take this forward?" Antonio answered without hesitation. "I am." "Why?" Antonio held his gaze. "Because I don't know if you talk like this to everyone, and I'm going to find out." The partner stiffened. The officer changed posture. "You trying to ruin our careers?" Antonio replied precisely. "I'm not trying to ruin anything. I'm trying to find out if you ruin people's dignity every day." The atmosphere hardened completely. Antonio finished. "Either you write it down now, or this goes into the report as refusal to identify." The partner looked at the other. A quick look, discreet, loaded with meaning. The officer took a deep breath, ran a hand over his face. "Souza, badge 8142, he pointed to his partner. "He's Mendez." Antonio looked at the patrol car. "And the number?" The officer replied, no longer in the same tone. "VTR 0921. Antonio stored it in silence. "Thank you." The officer narrowed his eyes. "And now?" Antonio replied, "Now the conversation becomes official." The partner swallowed hard. The officer felt it. He felt this was no longer just a stop. It was the beginning of something bigger. "Have you noticed this? When a simple sentence changes the entire weight of a situation, when someone makes it clear they won't let this die right there." Antonio didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't touch anyone. But he had done something neither of them expected. He had taken it seriously. And in that moment, the officer realized he had crossed a line. The officer Souza was still trying to sustain his tone, as if authority came only from voice. But his partner Mendez was no longer on the same rhythm. Mendez was looking at Antonio differently now. Not curiosity, reading. Antonio had remained standing the entire time, without asking permission to exist, without begging for respect, without falling into the trap of arguing by yelling. The cane was there, firm, as support and as a symbol, but his posture wasn't one of fragility. It was of someone who knows exactly where he stands and knows exactly what he's saying. Mendes noticed details that people who only want to command usually ignore. The way Antonio chose his words, short, direct, precise. No forced slang, no fancy terms, just what mattered. The way he demanded the reason for the stop without sounding desperate. The way he said legal basis, like someone who didn't memorize that from internet videos, like someone who had dealt with protocol before, like someone who had seen abuse disguised as procedure and no longer tolerates it. Souza fiddled with the radio, clipped to his shoulder, searching for any exit that would give him back control. "You're making a fuss over nothing. This is going to end badly." Antonio replied without irony, without raising his tone. "It already started badly when you decided to treat me as a suspect without accusation." Mendes felt the weight of that line. Souza tried another route, more aggressive, more personal. "You want to play righteous? Play smart?" Antonio didn't bite. "I'm not playing anything. I just don't accept abuse." Mendes took a deep breath, looked at Souza and then at Antonio, like someone seeing two things at once, excess on one side and firmness on the other. Souza clenched his jaw, irritated, and gave the order a third time, now without real conviction. "Up against the wall." Antonio didn't move. "You already asked that." "And I already answered." Brief silence. Mendes stepped closer, discreetly, without taking sides in words, but letting his body say the situation was no longer simple. He noticed Antonio wasn't looking for an audience, wasn't looking for outside protection. He wasn't appealing to anything. He was imposing a boundary with his presence alone, and that messes with the head of any authority that lives off submission. Mendes spoke quietly, almost like a sentence that comes out before you decide. This guy isn't just anyone. Souza turned his face, annoyed. "Cut it out!" Mendes didn't answer, because it wasn't an opinion. It was a professional instinct. Antonio spoke again, firm. "I'll repeat it once. If there's an accusation, you say what it is. If there isn't, you end this with respect." Souza had no immediate response, and Mendes noticed something else. Antonio wasn't just defending himself. He was steering the scenario. He was pushing the conversation into the right territory where orders need reasons, posture needs control, and abuse becomes risk. Have you ever seen someone impose respect without raising their voice? Souza tried to hide his discomfort. "Who do you think you are?" Antonio replied calmly. "I'm someone who won't accept being treated as less." Mendes stayed still, his eyes fixed on Antonio a second longer than normal. That calm wasn't passive. It was trained. Souza felt the ground shifting. And it was at that moment Mendes understood that this stop had been different from the start. It wasn't just a man being stopped on the street. It was a man who wouldn't let humiliation be born, and no one yet knew why. Souza was still trying to sustain the posture of someone who commands. But it wasn't the same anymore. His voice had lost firmness. His body no longer occupied space the same way. The orders no longer came out with conviction. Antonio noticed. Not out of arrogance. Out of reading. He planted the cane more firmly on the ground, straightened his shoulders and spoke, low, without hurry, without threat. "Call your commander now." Souza let out a short, humorless laugh. "You think this is what? A show?" Antonio didn't change expression. "No. I think this crossed the line. And now it needs to move up a level." Souza turned his face for a moment, searching for an exit that didn't exist. "You think you're going to intimidate me?" Antonio replied without hesitation. "I'm not intimidating you. I'm giving you a chance not to make this worse." Mendes stayed silent, watching. Souza breathed short. "Who do you want to talk to?" "Your commander." Souza still tried to hold control. "For what?" Antonio answered precisely. "Because you already tried to cuff me without cause, already stopped me without accusation, already talked to me like I was guilty. And now you're insisting on an illegal order." He paused briefly. "This doesn't get resolved just between us anymore." Souza stiffened. You're thinking you're too important. Antonio replied, I'm treating this with the importance it has. Silence. Sousa grabbed the radio clipped to his shoulder, stopped, looked at Mendez. Mendez didn't say anything, just held his gaze firm. Sousa swallowed hard, pulled out his phone, dialed, put it on speaker. Command, this is Patrol Unit 0921. On the other end, the voice came normal. Go ahead. Sousa took a deep breath. We stopped a man here. He's refusing to get up against the wall. He's refusing to cooperate. And he's saying he's going to open an investigation against us. Antonio interrupted without raising his tone. Correct that. Sousa looked at him. What? I didn't refuse to cooperate. I refused to be cuffed without cause and to obey an illegal order. That makes a difference. Sousa scowled. On the other end of the line, the voice shifted slightly. Repeat that. Sousa cleared his throat. He says the stop had no cause, that we tried to cuff him without legal basis, and that he's going to open an investigation. Antonio spoke directly into the phone, and I asked to speak to the commander for exactly that reason. There was a brief silence on the other end. Then the voice came back, more firm. What's the citizen's name? Antonio Ribeiro. Sousa answered quickly. Another silence, longer now. The breathing on the other end changed. Repeat the name, Sousa repeated. Antonio Ribeiro. Mendez noticed. The atmosphere changed without anyone raising their voice. On the other end of the line, hand the phone to him. Sousa froze for half a second, looked at Antonio, handed him the phone. Antonio brought it to his ear. Antonio speaking. He listened, didn't respond for a few seconds, just listened, then said, Yes, I'm being stopped without accusation. They tried to cuff me without legal basis. The tone has been offensive since the beginning. He listened a bit more. No, there was no resistance. There was refusal to abuse. Antonio handed the phone back to Sousa. Sousa put it to his ear. His posture changed right there. His chin dropped. His shoulders tightened. Yes, sir. Understood. He hung up, stayed silent for 2 seconds. Mendez looked at him. Sousa didn't answer, just put the phone back in his pocket. Antonio spoke calmly. Now you understand why I asked you to call your commander? Sousa didn't answer, because now he knew. The conversation had left his control and moved to a level where wrong posture becomes real consequence. Have you ever seen this, when someone thinks they're in charge and finds out they were only exposing themselves? Sousa took a deep breath, and in that moment it became clear. The voice on the phone didn't like what it heard. Sousa put the phone back into his pocket more carefully than before. He didn't say anything, didn't give an order, didn't joke, just stood there, trying to reorganize his posture. Mendez noticed immediately. That call had changed something. Antonio noticed too, but didn't comment. He simply took a deep breath, planted the cane more firmly on the ground, and spoke, low, firm, without any threatening tone. I'm not just any citizen. Sousa slowly raised his eyes, not with anger, with discomfort. What do you mean? Antonio kept his gaze fixed on him. I'm not just any citizen. And you already understand that. Sousa ran his tongue over his lips, nervous. What are you trying to say with that? Antonio replied plainly, I'm saying this stop isn't going to end the way you planned. Mendez looked away for a second. Sousa swallowed hard, tried to regain some control. You're thinking too highly of yourself. Antonio replied calmly, I'm telling the truth. Sousa took a short step sideways, like someone needing space. Then just say who you are. Antonio didn't answer right away. Not for cheap suspense. By choice. He let the silence do the work. Sousa felt it. Mendez felt it. That silence wasn't empty. It was loaded. You tried to cuff me without cause. Stopped me without accusation. Talked to me like I was less. Antonio said it like someone listing facts, not emotions. That doesn't happen when the person on the other side is just anyone. Sousa scowled. You threatening me now? Antonio answered immediately. No, I'm warning you. Mendez took a deep breath. Sousa looked at him, searching for support. Didn't find it. Antonio continued, there are people who accept being shoved into a patrol car just to avoid trouble. I'm not that type. Sousa felt the weight of that. You think you're better than others? Antonio replied firmly. I think I deserve the same respect as anyone else. The silence weighed again. Sousa scratched his forehead, nervous. So why all this? Antonio replied, because you started wrong and insisted on staying wrong. Mendez watched in silence, increasingly convinced this stop had gone way too far. Sousa took a deep breath. You really going to take this all the way? Antonio answered without hesitation. I am. How far? Antonio held his gaze. As far as it needs to go. Sousa closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, he no longer looked confident. Who are you, anyway? Antonio replied without raising his voice. Someone who won't let this become routine. Sousa swallowed hard, because in that moment he understood something he hadn't before. That man wasn't just defending himself, he was opening a case. He was pulling a thread that couldn't be dropped anymore. Have you ever seen this? When the person on the other side makes it clear they won't disappear after humiliation, that they won't pretend nothing happened. Sousa felt his stomach tighten, because he realized that story was only just beginning, and the part he feared most hadn't even been said yet, and that was still very little. Sousa was still trying to absorb everything, the name, the position, the complete reversal of the situation. Antonio didn't use that silence to humiliate anyone. He used it to change the direction of the conversation. His voice came out calm, lower than before, more controlled. Now I want to see how you treat everyone. Not just me. Sousa raised his eyes. What do you mean? Antonio replied plainly. I'm not here to use my position as a shield. I'm here to see if what you did to me is an exception. Or if it's the standard. Mendez felt the weight of that. Sousa took a deep breath. What exactly do you want? Antonio spoke like someone who already had the procedure ready in his head. Both your full names, badge numbers, exact time of the stop, recorded reason, protocol applied. And what was the legal basis for the attempted cuffing? Sousa swallowed hard. You're going to file a report? Antonio replied. I already am. He took a small notebook out of the inner pocket of his coat, opened it, took a pen. Not for theatrics, for method. Start with the time. Sousa looked at Mendez, then at his watch. 4:16:23. Antonio wrote it down. Full name. Sousa. Rafael Sousa. Antonio wrote. Badge number. Sousa answered. Antonio wrote. Now you. Mendez answered in a low voice. Antonio wrote that too. Sousa scratched his forehead. Is all this really necessary? Antonio replied without lifting his head. Yes, because this isn't about me. He raised his eyes. It's about the next person you stop. Sousa stayed silent. Do you talk like this to every elderly man? Do you try to cuff everyone without accusation? Do you treat anyone as a suspect because of attitude? Mendez looked away. Sousa didn't answer. Antonio continued. If this happens once, it's a mistake. If it happens all the time, it's a pattern. And patterns become institutional problems. Sousa took a deep breath. You're taking this to internal affairs? Antonio replied. I am. Because of the way it happened? Antonio held his gaze. Because of the way it happened. And because I don't know who else you've done this to. Sousa pressed his lips. That could mean suspension. Antonio replied firmly. That could prevent something worse in the future. The atmosphere was no longer confrontation. It was adjustment. It was consequence. You want to destroy our careers? Antonio replied. I want to correct a procedure. If that affects you, it's because you're part of it. Sousa breathed short. And if internal affairs shelves it? Antonio replied. Then I'll know the problem isn't just on the street. Mendez felt a chill in his stomach. Antonio closed the notebook for a moment. This isn't revenge. It's responsibility. Sousa stood there, You'd do this even if it weren't you, Antonio replied without hesitation. I'm doing this because it was me. But I'm continuing because it's not just me. The silence weighed again. Sousa realized this wasn't personal. It was structural. Antonio put the pen away. Now you're going to follow protocol, the way it should have been from the start. Sousa replied quietly, Yes, sir. Antonio corrected immediately. Don't call me sir. Call me citizen. Mendes raised his eyes. Sousa froze for a second. Antonio finished. Because that's how you're going to treat everyone from now on. Have you ever thought about this? How many injustices keep happening just because nobody turns humiliation into procedure? Sousa felt it. Mendes felt it. And in that moment it was clear. He wasn't speaking just for himself. The notebook was still open in Antonio's hand, the pen hovering in the air. He was no longer demanding data. Now he was demanding conscience. He raised his eyes, first to Sousa, then to Mendes, and asked in a low, firm tone, without attack, Do you talk like this to every elderly man? Sousa opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the ground for a second, then looked away, didn't answer. Antonio didn't repeat the question. He didn't need to. The silence answered for him. Do you treat everyone as a suspect because of attitude? Or does this only happen to people you think won't complain? Sousa breathed short. Mendes stiffened. Neither of them said anything. Antonio planted the cane a little further forward, not as a threat, as an anchor. How many times has this happened today? Sousa swallowed hard. I don't know. Antonio answered immediately. You do. Sousa closed his eyes for half a second. When he opened them, there was no more arrogance there, just discomfort. This is just a misunderstanding. Antonio replied calmly, No. This is a pattern that just got interrupted. Mendes raised his eyes. We just do routine stops. Antonio held his gaze. Routine isn't an excuse for humiliation. Silence again. Antonio took a short step forward. Have you ever talked like this to someone who looked wealthy? To someone in a suit? To someone who looked important? Sousa pressed his lips. It's not like that. Antonio replied, It's exactly like that. He paused briefly. The difference is that today you picked the wrong target. Sousa took a deep breath. You're saying we choose who to humiliate? Antonio replied without irony. I'm asking if you choose who to respect. Mendes lowered his head. Sousa stood there. Antonio continued, Because if this happens once, it's a mistake. If it happens all the time, it's culture. Sousa spoke quietly. It's not fair to generalize. Antonio replied immediately, It's not fair to humiliate. The silence grew heavy. It was no longer confrontation. It was exposure. Antonio slowly closed the notebook. I'm not asking this for me. He raised his eyes. I'm asking for those who don't know how to answer. Sousa breathed short. We just follow orders. Antonio replied, An illegal order protects no one. Mendes swallowed hard. Antonio finished. Do you talk like this to every elderly man? This time he didn't say it in an accusing tone. He said it in a diagnostic tone. Sousa didn't answer. Mendes didn't either. And that's when both of them understood. There was no defense left, no excuse left, because that simple question had blown a hole in their entire argument. Have you ever seen this? When a question hurts more than any scolding, when nobody yells, nobody threatens, nobody humiliates, but everyone knows they were wrong? Sousa felt it. Mendes felt it. And in that moment it was clear to both of them, this hurt more than any reprimand. Antonio looked at the patrol car, then at the uniform, then at the faces of the two officers. His tone didn't change, but the direction of the conversation completely did. Are the patrol car cameras on? Sousa took half a second to answer. They are. Antonio nodded slightly, with no satisfaction at all. And the body camera. Mendes touched his chest, almost by reflex. That too. Antonio paused briefly. It didn't look like relief. It looked like confirmation. Good. Sousa frowned. Good why? Antonio replied without raising his voice. Because now this conversation doesn't depend on memory anymore. It depends on record. He pointed first to the patrol car, then to Mendez's chest. I want the footage of the stop, from the moment you decided to pull me over. No cuts, no edits, no technical issues. Sousa crossed his arms. That's not how it works. Antonio replied immediately. That's exactly how it works when there's suspicion of abuse. Mendez looked away. Sousa tried to keep firm. You can't demand that now. Antonio took a short step to the side, standing in the patrol car camera's line. I can, and I am. He continued, and I also want the audio, the tone of voice, the exact words, the moment you ordered me up against the wall without any accusation. Sousa took a deep breath. That's internal procedure. Antonio replied, Perfect. Then you already know where this is going. He looked at both of them. You talk like camera is a threat. To me, camera is protection. Mendez swallowed hard. We didn't do anything wrong. Antonio replied, Then the footage will help you. Silence. Antonio planted the cane more firmly on the ground. I also want the patrol car GPS. Exact time of the stop. How long you stayed here. And the incident report you haven't even started writing yet. Sousa's eyes widened for a moment. You're crossing the line now. Antonio replied calmly, I'm drawing the line you ignored. He paused briefly. You remember the phrase, everything is recorded? Mendez nodded slowly. Antonio continued, It's not just video. It's protocol. It's time. It's route. It's history. Sousa tried to laugh nervously. You really think all this is going to lead to anything? Antonio replied, It will lead to what it always leads to when there's proof. He stepped a little closer to the patrol car. Truth doesn't need witnesses. It just needs record. Silence again. Antonio looked at both of them. Who do you think people will believe? You or the cameras? Sousa didn't answer. Mendez didn't either. Antonio concluded, Everything is recorded. He left the sentence hanging, not as a threat, as a verdict, because at that moment, the conversation was no longer word against word. It was image against excuse, and the recording had already done its job. The black car pulled up slowly, a bit away from the patrol car. No siren, no rush. The door opened. A man stepped out, straight posture, firm stride, alert eyes. Antonio didn't move, didn't adjust his clothes, didn't straighten the cane, just stayed there, as he already was. The commander walked straight up to him, stopped less than a meter away, looked into Antonio's eyes for a full second, then snapped to attention. Good afternoon, Mr. Antonio Ribeiro. Sousa froze. Mendez stiffened. The air seemed heavier. Antonio replied with a slight nod. No ceremony, no theatrics. Good afternoon. The commander turned toward the two officers. His tone changed. What's going on here? Sousa tried to speak first. Commander, The commander raised his hand. Not yet. He pointed to Antonio. First, you. Antonio spoke calmly, without raising his voice. I was stopped without accusation. Treated with hostility. Told to get up against the wall. They tried to cuff me without legal basis. And now I'm asking for the footage of the stop. The commander didn't interrupt. He just listened. When Antonio finished, he slowly turned to Sousa. Is that accurate? Sousa opened his mouth, closed it. We just thought his behavior was suspicious. The commander replied immediately. Suspicious of what? Sousa hesitated. He questioned the stop. The commander took a deep breath. Questioning a stop is not a crime. He looked at Mendez. Do you think so too? Mendez shook his head. No, sir. The commander took 2 short steps toward the patrol car. Were the cameras on? Yes, sir. Body cam too? Yes, sir. The commander went back near Antonio. The footage is already being preserved. Antonio replied, Good. The commander looked again at the 2 officers. You know what this means. Sousa swallowed hard. Commander, it was a misunderstanding. The commander replied, "It wasn't." He pointed to Antonio. "This isn't just any citizen being stopped. This is an irregular stop being documented." Silence. Antonio spoke. "I don't want privilege. I want the same respect any person should receive." The commander nodded. "That's exactly what's at stake here." He turned to Sousa and Mendez. "You are both removed from street duty until further notice." Both froze. Sousa tried to react. "Commander, enough!" The commander looked back at Antonio. "The investigation is already open." Antonio replied, "As it should be." The commander took a deep breath. "Do you want to add anything?" Antonio thought for a moment. "I do." He pointed to the two officers. "I want to know if they talk like this to every elderly man." Absolute silence. The commander didn't answer right away. He just looked at both of them, and that silence said everything. Antonio concluded, "Then let's find out." The commander nodded. "We will." Sousa lowered his head. Mendez turned pale. The commander turned his back on them and stood beside Antonio, not as a superior, as someone who understood exactly the weight of that moment, because there, no one was pretending authority anymore, and the hierarchy had just switched places. Antonio took a step forward, not toward the officers, toward the commander. His voice came firm, without anger, without spectacle. "It's not about rank, it's about respect." The commander kept his eyes on him. Antonio continued, "If I were just an old man walking down the street, this would have ended in handcuffs, in embarrassment, in yet another poorly written report to justify abuse." He turned his face toward Sousa. "You didn't treat me badly because you thought I was dangerous. You treated me badly because you thought you could." Silence. Mendez lowered his eyes. Antonio didn't soften his tone. "Authority without control becomes habit. Habit becomes pattern. And pattern becomes violence disguised as protocol." He pointed to the patrol car. "How many stops like this have you already made? How many ended without anyone complaining?" The commander took a deep breath. "This will be investigated." Antonio replied immediately, "It won't just be investigated. It will be confronted." He turned his gaze back to Sousa. "You didn't make a mistake because you didn't know who I was. You made a mistake because you forgot who you are." Sousa tried to speak. "Sir, I—" Antonio raised his hand. "Not now." He turned back to the commander. "I don't want a token punishment for show. I want real change, training, protocol review, and people off the street until they learn how to treat people like people." The commander nodded without saying anything. Antonio concluded, "Because today it was me. Tomorrow it could be your father, your mother, your grandfather." He let the silence do the rest, then spoke more quietly. "Respect doesn't depend on a badge." The commander replied, "You're right." Antonio slightly turned his body, facing Sousa and Mendez. "This didn't end when I said my name. This started there." He pointed to the spot on the sidewalk where he had been stopped. "You'll be remembered for this scene. The difference is what you do with it." Sousa took a deep breath. Mendez still couldn't raise his eyes. Antonio finished, "Everyone can make mistakes. Not everyone accepts learning." He looked back at the commander. "Now I want to see what this institution does when nobody's filming." The commander replied, "We'll do what has to be done." Antonio stayed silent for a second, then said, "Then let's find out." He took half a step back, his posture still firm, his voice still calm. But the message had been delivered, because there it wasn't about rank. It wasn't about position. It wasn't about who commanded. It was about how you treat someone when you think nobody important is watching. Do you think respect depends on a uniform? And there, Antonio still wasn't finished. Antonio didn't raise his voice, didn't change his tone, didn't make a speech. He simply took a step to the side, like someone shifting position to better see what comes next. "Open the case." The commander blinked once. "Sir?" Antonio kept his gaze fixed. "Open the case for abuse of authority and for discriminatory conduct." The silence grew heavier. Sousa pressed his lips. Mendez took a deep breath but didn't say anything. The commander tried to choose his words. "Director, this will cause repercussions." Antonio replied immediately. "It already has. Just so far, only for the ones on the wrong side of the badge." He pointed to the location of the stop. This wasn't a momentary excess. This was a behavior pattern. The commander nodded. "We'll register it," Antonio continued. "Not just register it. Open a formal investigation. Immediate removal of both from the street. Impound the patrol car. Full copies of body cam and central footage." Sousa swallowed hard. "Sir, this is heavy." Antonio turned to him. "What's heavy is cuffing someone without legal basis. What's heavy is talking to a person like they're worth nothing. This here is consequence." He turned back to the commander. "If you bury this in a drawer, I'll take it outside the corporation. District attorney. External oversight. Whatever it takes." The commander straightened his posture. "It won't be buried." Antonio crossed his arms. "Then put it on paper now." The commander signaled to an aide who had arrived discreetly. "Start the procedure." The aide opened a tablet. Antonio dictated without hesitation. Date, time, location, names, reason for the stop, language used, attempted cuffing without legal cause, discriminatory conduct. He paused for a second. Also include refusal to inform the reason for the stop. The aide typed quickly. Sousa looked at the ground. Mendez breathed short. Antonio continued. Include preventive suspension and prohibition from conducting stops until the investigation is complete. The commander nodded. I'm authorizing it. Antonio didn't soften. And this isn't going to be a lukewarm internal review. It's a full disciplinary process. The commander replied, It will be. Antonio then did something simple. He took his phone out of his pocket, wrote something down. Protocol number? The aide read it out loud. Antonio repeated it to himself. I'll follow every step. He put the phone away. Because this isn't personal. It's institutional. He looked at Sousa. Today, you learn not everyone bows their head, and not everyone who's humiliated stays silent. Sousa tried to speak. Antonio interrupted without aggression. Not now. He turned back to the commander. When does the first order come out? In 48 hours. Antonio replied, I expect less. The commander nodded. Antonio took half a step back. The atmosphere had changed. Now nobody argued, nobody laughed, nobody tried to impose authority. Only written reality remained. He looked at the two officers once more. This will move forward, with or without an apology. He turned his body to leave, stopped, looked over his shoulder. You think this ends in a report? And there. Now came the consequence. The twist of the key in the patrol car's ignition sounded different that time. Not like the start of a patrol, like an ending. Sousa and Mendez stood beside the car, the door open, the radio off. The commander read out loud, without raising his voice, immediate removal from operational duty, surrender of weapons, impound of the patrol car, mandatory appearance at Internal Affairs tomorrow at 8. Antonio heard everything without crossing his arms, without smiling, without changing expression, because that wasn't victory. It was correction. Sousa took a deep breath. Sir, this is going to end my career. Antonio replied immediately. No. What ends careers is thinking you can treat people like things. Mendez finally raised his eyes. We were just doing our job. Antonio turned his face to him. No. You were doing it the wrong way. The commander handed a folder to the aide. Initial report filed. Antonio took a step forward. I want a digital copy now. The aide handed over the tablet. Antonio read silently, line by line, without hurry. Inappropriate language. Stop without grounds. Attempted cuffing without legal cause. Discriminatory conduct. He handed the tablet back. This doesn't stay like this. The commander nodded. It won't. Antonio pointed to the patrol car. This stop didn't start today. Today, it just ended differently. Sousa clenched his fists. So that's it. It's done. Antonio replied firmly. It's not done. It's done now. He looked back at both of them. You're off the street. But what you did will keep moving forward. The patrol car radio turned back on. Another unit was called to pick them up. The atmosphere weighed heavy. No spectacle, no shouting, just the weight of what could no longer be ignored. The commander spoke quietly. Director, Internal Affairs will hear everything. Antonio replied, not just hear, they'll act. He took half a step back, because this isn't an isolated case. It's a pattern that was never confronted. Sousa tried to argue. You're exaggerating. Antonio cut him off. What's exaggerated is thinking power gives permission. Mendez took a deep breath. We're going to pay for this? Antonio replied without harshness. You're going to answer for this. He looked at the commander. I want a supplementary report with the history of this unit's stops, times, neighborhoods, profiles of the people stopped. The commander nodded. I'll request it. Antonio concluded, because justice isn't just punishing today's mistake, it's preventing tomorrow's mistake. The new patrol car arrived. Sousa and Mendez got in silently. The door closed. The car drove away slowly. Antonio stood still for a few seconds. A light wind brushed his coat. He didn't look relieved. He looked resolved. He turned to the commander. This doesn't end with a suspension. The commander replied, I know. Antonio turned away. Then let's see how far this goes. He started walking, stopped for a moment. Do you think suspension solves everything? And there, human justice was still missing. Sousa came back, without a patrol car, without a full uniform, without a posture of authority. He stopped a few steps from Antonio, hands clasped in front of his body. Eyes down. Director, I wanted to talk to you. Antonio didn't answer right away. He stayed silent, observing. Without hurry, Sousa took a deep breath. I was wrong. I crossed the line. I said things I shouldn't have. He raised his eyes but didn't hold them. I never thought it would end like this. Antonio stayed silent, didn't cross his arms, didn't look away, didn't make a judgmental expression. Sousa swallowed hard. I'm sorry. The wind passed between them. No one interrupted. Antonio finally spoke. Sorry for what? Sousa froze for a second. For the way I treated you. Antonio didn't change his tone. Only that? Sousa took a deep breath. For the abuse of authority. For trying to cuff you without cause. For the way I spoke. Antonio took half a step forward. And the other times? Sousa frowned. Other times? Antonio replied without raising his voice. How many people have you stopped like this? How many you embarrassed? How many you thought you could treat as less? Sousa stayed silent. Antonio continued. You're apologizing because it went wrong, or because you understood what you did. Sousa pressed his lips. Because I understood. Antonio held his gaze. Late, but necessary. Sousa shook his head. I didn't want this to become all this. Antonio replied. It became because it already was. He took a step to the side. An apology doesn't erase conduct, but it shows if someone learned something. Sousa spoke more quietly. I lost my function, my team, my reputation. Antonio replied without harshness. You lost it because you thought you had the right. Sousa took a deep breath. I'm not racist. Antonio replied immediately. That's not for you to decide. He stayed silent for a second. What you do when you think nobody important is watching, that says who you are. Sousa closed his eyes for a moment. I messed up badly. Antonio nodded slightly. Yes. Sousa raised his eyes. Do you accept my apology? Antonio didn't answer right away. The silence weighed. Then he said, I hear your apology. But the people you hurt before me deserve to hear it too. Sousa lowered his head. I understand. Antonio concluded. An apology doesn't close anything. It only opens the chance to change. Sousa took a deep breath. I will change. Antonio replied, I hope so. He turned his body, took 2 steps, stopped, spoke without looking back. You didn't apologize because I'm a director. You apologized because you got caught." Sousa didn't answer. Antonio finished. "The difference between remorse and fear is what you do afterward." He stayed silent for a second, then said, "And now comes the hard part." Sousa raised his eyes. And then, Antonio said the sentence. Antonio stood still, body still turned towards Sousa, the heavy silence between them. No audience, no spectacle, no need for a loud voice. He took a deep breath, not from nervousness, from control, then spoke in a firm, low, precise tone. "I didn't humiliate you." Sousa slowly raised his eyes. Antonio continued, "I didn't expose you. I didn't bring you down. I didn't treat you as less." He took half a step forward. "You did that yourself." Sousa swallowed hard. Antonio kept his tone. "I just let the consequence arrive." He paused, looked at the street. At the wall he had been told to lean against, at the place where they tried to cuff him, then looked back at Sousa. "The problem wasn't with me." Sousa frowned. Antonio explained, "The problem was with dignity." He took a deep breath. "You humiliated dignity when you talked to me like that. When you tried to cuff me without legal basis. When you thought you could use the uniform as a shield." Sousa stayed silent. Antonio continued, "It wasn't about rank. It wasn't about position. It wasn't about who I am." He discreetly pointed to the ground. "It was about who you decided to be in that moment." Sousa lowered his gaze. Antonio sustained his words. "You weren't punished for stopping me. You were punished because you abused." He paused again. "And abuse always collects." Sousa took a deep breath. Antonio then said with complete clarity, "He didn't humiliate anyone. He humiliated dignity until dignity responded." Sousa raised his eyes, impacted. Antonio continued, "That applies to me, to you, to anyone who confuses power with permission." He took a step back. "Who respects doesn't fear investigation. Who abuses always thinks it will never be them." Sousa spoke quietly. "I learned." Antonio replied without harshness. "Learning is the minimum." He stayed silent for a second, then concluded, "What changes a story isn't revenge. It's consequence." Sousa didn't answer. Antonio turned his body, took 2 steps, stopped again. Without looking back, said, "You didn't fall because I'm a director. You fell because you crossed the line." The wind passed through the street. Antonio stayed still for a second, then spoke, still firm, "And dignity always responds." He started walking, but before leaving completely, he left a question hanging in the air. Have you ever seen someone lose everything just because they thought they could treat someone else as less? And now I ask you. The street went back to normal. Cars passing, people walking, the walls still there. The same place where Antonio had been told to lean against, where they tried to cuff him, where they talked to him like he was less. He stood still for a few seconds, looking at the ground, not with anger, with that kind of silence that comes after an injustice is exposed. Can you imagine yourself there, told to lean against a wall without cause, called a suspect just for existing, spoken to in a tone not used with people? Antonio took a deep breath, not from relief, from clarity, because he knew it wasn't just about him. It was about the next one, and the next, and the next. Would you accept this? Would you accept being treated like this in a stop? Without a clear accusation, without respect, without the right to speak? And if it were your father, your grandfather, someone who worked his whole life, paid taxes, raised a family, and still was treated like a problem? Antonio walked slowly to the spot where the patrol car had stopped, looked at the ground, then at the street, then at the sky. There was no victory on his face. There was responsibility, because he knew that if he stayed quiet that day, it would keep happening to others. Have you ever swallowed an injustice just to avoid trouble? Have you stayed silent because you thought it wouldn't help to say anything? Have you accepted disrespect because it seemed too small to become a problem? Antonio didn't accept it. Not because he's a director, but because dignity is not negotiable. He didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't make a spectacle. He just set a boundary. And boundaries change everything. Would you set that boundary? Would you have the courage to say no when someone in uniform tries to treat you as less? Would you have the calm not to turn aggressive? Would you have the firmness not to become submissive? Antonio did. And that's why the story changed. Not out of revenge, out of consequence. He looked one more time at the wall, at the place where everything started, and understood that stop wasn't an accident. It was a pattern. And patterns only change when someone interrupts them. Would you interrupt? Would you let it pass? Would you accept it in silence? The wind passed through the street. Antonio started walking, without hurry, without pose, without any sense of victory, just with the certainty that it wasn't over yet, and the story still wasn't over. The gate of the battalion opened slowly. No siren, no announcement, no one running after anyone. Antonio walked through in silence, posture upright, face neutral, not looking back, because what needed to be said had already been said, and what needed to be done had already started. Have you noticed how things change when someone stops accepting wrong as normal? Inside the building, the administrative process was already open. Full names of the officers, time of the stop, patrol car number, record of the call to the commander, initial report for abuse of authority, parallel report for discriminatory conduct, everything documented, no spectacle, no rush, no revenge, just protocol, just consequence. Antonio didn't attend the meeting, didn't stay to hear justifications, didn't want to know alternative versions, because he knew one simple thing: when truth goes into paper, it doesn't come out. Have you ever seen someone lose everything, not for one mistake, but for insisting on it? The two officers were taken off the street that same day. Administrative duty. No weapon, no patrol car, no command, no public apology. For now. One of them tried to call Antonio. He didn't answer, not out of anger, but because the conversation was already over. Do you also think an apology without change isn't worth much? The commander signed the formal opening of the internal investigation, ordered analysis of the patrol car cameras, of the audio of the stop, of the history of the two, not just that day, all of it, because patterns don't come out of nowhere, and nobody becomes abusive in one single stop. Antonio left the building through the side door, the same door he entered that morning. No escort, no official car, no pose, just his own steps. He stopped for a second on the sidewalk, took a deep breath, not from relief, but from responsibility, because he knew that wasn't the end. It was the beginning of an adjustment. Have you ever felt that strange weight when you do the right thing, even knowing it will bother a lot of people? Antonio felt it, but didn't step back, didn't ask to soften it, didn't ask to shelve it, didn't ask to solve it internally, because solving it internally often just sweeps it under the rug, and he wasn't there to sweep anything, he was there to change something. The sun hit his face. He put on his sunglasses, started walking down the street, without hurry, without a victorious expression, without a taste for revenge, just with the certainty that from that day on, someone would think twice before abusing a uniform. Do you also believe consequence teaches more than speeches? Antonio got into his car, started the engine, didn't turn on the radio, didn't make any calls, just drove. Because he knew the story wasn't over, that a response was coming, that consequences were coming, that justice was coming, not just administrative, but human. He turned the corner, disappeared down the street, and left behind a system that for the first time that day had been forced to look at itself in the mirror. But dignity still had the last word. The street went on as if nothing had happened, cars passing, people coming and going. The same wall, the same intersection, the same place where Antonio had been treated as less. But nothing there was the same anymore, because something changes when someone doesn't accept wrong as normal. Antonio was already far away. No audience, no interview, no speech, no visible victory. Just the certainty that that stop wouldn't be forgotten, nor buried, nor treated as a misunderstanding. Have you noticed how injustice only continues when everyone stays quiet? He didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't use rank as a shield. He used a boundary. He used truth. He used consequence, and that was stronger than any scolding. The investigation continued. The reports were open. The cameras were being analyzed. The histories were being pulled. Not just that day, all of them. Because patterns only appear when someone decides to look. Antonio gained nothing from this. No money, no fame, no applause. He gained discomfort. He gained silent enemies. He gained a system that now knew it couldn't pretend anymore. Have you ever been afraid to tell the truth because it seemed only you would pay the price? He told it anyway, because he knew that if he stayed quiet, it would keep happening to others. Other elderly people, other calm people, others who don't yell, others who just want respect. That sentence still echoed. He didn't humiliate anyone. He humiliated dignity, until dignity responded. And maybe that's the most uncomfortable part of the whole story. It wasn't only about racism. It wasn't only about abuse of authority. It was about silence. It was about normalizing disrespect. It was about thinking that's just how it is. It was about thinking it's no use reacting. Antonio reacted. Without violence, without scandal, without hate. Just with firmness, just with clarity, just with truth. Would you stay quiet in his place? Would you swallow this to avoid trouble? Would you let it go because it won't lead to anything? Or would you set a boundary? Because boundaries change stories, and sometimes they change entire systems. The street looked the same, but something there had been adjusted. Something there had been interrupted. Something there had been exposed. And now comes the part that no longer depends on Antonio. It depends on who watches. It depends on who remembers. It depends on who no longer accepts wrong as normal. It depends on who chooses which side to be on. I stand with the truth. And you,